So let's talk about universal basic income and whether or not the left should support it. So yesterday I tweeted this: universal basic income is just Social Security for all. It might sound extreme, but it's not. What's really extreme is multi-trillion-dollar wars, Wall Street bailouts, corporate welfare, and special tax breaks for the ultra-wealthy. Now that framing, Social Security for all, I think everybody who's for universal basic income should start using that framing. Because we have Medicare for all, that's overwhelmingly popular. I think universal basic income, if you phrase it like that, the initial reaction from people is going to be, that sounds extreme. And why do I think that? Because that's how I felt. That's how I felt when I saw universal basic income. I was like, ooh, I don't know. My first thought was, I don't know if that's economically feasible. My second thought is that sounds a little extreme. But I think if you phrase it as Social Security for all of a sudden, it doesn't feel so extreme. It actually feels perfectly normal and fine. So I think we need to all get on that page, Social Security for all, if this is a policy that you support. Now, we should dive a little deeper into the specifics, though, because they're important. So a Canadian town in the 1970s experimented with this. And what happened when they did a universal basic income program in this town is that the hospitalization rate went down by 8.5%. Kids performed much better in school. Domestic violence went down. Mental health complaints went down, and the only people who worked a little less, because that's the core argument against this, is that, oh my God, it'll lead to people being lazy. The only people who worked a little less were new mothers, which you could argue is actually a good thing that they work less, and students who actually stayed in school a little bit longer. And again, you could argue that that's a good thing. Now, that's just one example, and it's a small sample size, admittedly. But in London in 2009, they experimented again with universal basic income. So, and this again, small sample size, so take it for what it's worth. If you want to say, hey, take it with a grain of salt, by all means, go right ahead. They gave 13 homeless people £3,000 and no strings attached. And they simply asked, what do you think you need? And after a year and a half, 7 people had a roof over their heads. 2 were about to move into an apartment. And all of them had taken steps towards personal growth. And the awesome thing about it is, with this program, so it worked pretty well, but it also saved £300,000, less than what the alternative was. I mean, I don't know how you could beat that. Now, probably the biggest example of a success is, since 1982, Alaska has sent a dividend check to every resident. And that's basically because they publicly own their oil and minerals. So it pays up to $2,000 per person, or $8,288 for a family of 4. And so in other words, you just get a check for living in Alaska because certain industries are nationalized, and so you reap the rewards of that. You reap the profits of that. So you just get a check, and they say that full-time employment did not change at all, and the share of Alaskans who worked part-time jobs increased by 17%. So again, that's a good example of this doesn't necessarily increase the employment situation. If you give people a little bit of money, it's not like everybody all of a sudden becomes super lazy. The overwhelming majority of people go, I still want to have meaning in my life, and that might require looking for a job that's fulfilling. So that's a positive. Now, it is true that Finland recently experimented with universal basic income, and they scrapped the program after just 2 years. Why they scrapped the program, that's open to interpretation and discussion. You know, it was a centrist government that effectively scrapped the program, so you could argue that they had prior ideological commitments and they didn't really want to see it through to its conclusion. So it could have been for political reasons why they scrapped it, and it wasn't a true test of the idea of universal basic income. But what's funny is that this is now framed as, even though I just gave you 3 examples where it's been relatively successful, people look at the one example of Finland, the fact that they stopped the universal basic income small program that they were doing a trial run on. They look at that as like a definitive failure of universal basic income, and therefore it's stupid and we shouldn't even look into it. Now, I honestly find that argument particularly hilarious and silly because it's not even a matter of like, oh, what works? Like, what does that mean, what works? There's pretty much a tautology embedded in the idea hey, if somebody's poor, perhaps they lack money. So maybe giving them a little money is actually a good thing because you help limit, or in some cases eliminate, poverty. So the idea that hey, does it work? What does that mean? What do you mean work? What's your goal? Because you could argue that at face value, by its very nature, it is fixing a problem, even if it may have some other unintended consequences that we might have to address. By its very nature, you might say, that's not even a tangible question. That question falls short because it's not legitimate in a way. So, but I understand people say, I prefer this other system as opposed to UBI, and maybe, because I used to be in favor of what's called a negative income tax as opposed to a universal basic income system, because I argued negative income tax, the money goes to where it's needed more. So in other words, if you make a very small amount of money per year, let's say somebody makes like $15,000 per year, they would basically get a net subsidy from the federal government. So they wouldn't have an income tax that they have to pay. They have a negative income tax and they get a net subsidy because they make so little, and it helps, make up the difference. And my argument was the money goes where it needs to go when you do it that way. But there is a problem, because when you do it like that, when you do a negative income tax, that can be framed as welfare. And as we know, welfare historically gets maligned way more than universal programs, and welfare programs are more likely to be put on the chopping block later down the road because they're welfare programs and because they can be maligned. Whereas universal programs, everybody's privy to them, so people are a lot less likely to want to take it down because it's something that everybody enjoys the fruits of. So that's why I now think, one of many reasons why I now think Social Security for all is actually feasible, economically feasible, and also probably better than a negative income tax. But this is something that, the left should seriously be talking about. And final point is this. There's actually a crossover effect with this proposal that a lot of people don't realize. See, when I first bring up the idea of universal basic income, you probably think far left. Like, that's a far left. Well, you want to give people money? Is that what you want to do? You want to give people money for nothing? That's crazy. That's far left. Not necessarily, because it depends how you craft the program. There are ways to craft the program that actually will get crossover support from the right because of how it's crafted. So, for example, what I mean by that is we have in the United States a sprawling welfare system, social safety net. Now, it's meager compared to the rest of the developed world, but we still have countless programs that help the poor, whether it's the SNAP program, which is the food stamp program, or the WIC program, or any of a number of programs that help the poor. What if you did a universal basic income system, a social security system, that basically eliminated the however many hundreds of different government programs that help the poor, you scrap those, and then you replace it with the universal basic income program, the Social Security for all program. So instead of, okay, I got to go to this program in order to get formula for my baby, I got to go to this program in order to get some money in order to pay this bill or that bill. No, what if it was just every month you get a check, everybody in the country gets it, it's a Social Security check, a universal basic income check, and that's the main part of our safety net. Now, that doesn't mean we don't also strive for Medicare for all. We should. And that doesn't mean you have like no other government programs, full stop. No, it just means you can limit the number of them. You can get rid of some of them and replace it with a universal basic income check. But I would argue that in order for it to make sense, it has to be equal to or more than what the current benefits are, because I already think our benefits are too meager in this country. Our safety net is too frugal, and we got to catch up to the rest of the developed world. But bottom line is, here's the main point. If you're on the right and you think you don't like this, think again. Because quite literally, if you argue against it, you're arguing in favor of bigger government. And you're supposed to not like big government if you're on the right. So just some food for thought. I think this idea can appeal to many leftists, Social Security for all, but also many people on the right if they stop to think about the implications of it. And, the biggest concern people have is, what about unemployment? It's going to make people lazy. They're going to want to stay home. All I can say is there's mixed evidence on that front. Okay? So it's a reasonable concern, but perhaps not as much as people make it out to be. But I would argue, even if it does slightly increase unemployment, because people choose, I'm going to check out now because I get a little check every month. So what? There, I said it. Who cares? So, there's always going to be a small number of people in every economy that's just like, I kind of want to check out of the system. So if you tick that up 1% as a result of a universal basic income program, is that worth it? I would say yes. You might disagree, but I think we have a disagreement. So anyway, interesting issue we should talk more about. Social Security for all. Is this something the left should get on board with?